Hello and welcome to the Overlanding podcast, a podcast dedicated to vehicle-dependent travel. I'm your host Andy Smith, and throughout the series I'll be chatting with adventurous people who have chosen to travel the world by bicycle, motorcycle, car and truck. The aim of the podcast is to discover what motivates people to embark on life-changing journeys, and to hear some incredible stories along the way. You can find us on iTunes and Stitcher by searching the Overlanding podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate and review our show, as this helps to boost it up the listings. Alternatively, you can visit our website, theoverlandingpodcast.com, where you can also listen to all the previous episodes. In this episode, I chat to Ed Gill and Jon Beardmore over a few cold beers. Both Jon and Ed have incredible experience and wisdom under their belts from extended periods on the road. We discuss both their adventures, which took similar routes, Ed by motorbike and Jon by 4x4 through Central Asia, which is a topic we stuck on for quite a while. We talk about winging it, lessons learnt, logistics, staying safe, politics, playing charades and life on the road. So let's get cracking. Right, we are recording. Okay. The same way we start every podcast, out of these 5 locations, where would you prefer this interview to take place? Near a babbling brook in a lush green valley, in a little tent on a windy mountaintop, on a warm beach with the sea lapping at your feet, D, round a nighttime campfire in a forest, or E, deep in a tropical jungle.
You can't go for the bit of beach, Jon.
The beach, mate, definitely. Cool beer in our hand, relaxing.
That's not really pursuant to the kind of adversarial lifestyle of an overlander, though, is it? You know.
What, you drive to the beach, park up with your tent and your barbecue and your beer fridge, and you relax and enjoy the scenery.
Can we discount the beach and agree on a different one?
Okay.
I suppose was it Babbling Brook?
Yeah, near a babbling brook in a lush green valley. Sounds nice.
I like that one.
Okay.
You can pick another one and we can agree on that one if you want.
We'll be in the forest with a fire.
Forest with fire's good with me.
Okay.
So we'll go on that one.
To be honest, the fire is the most popular scenario, because typically that's where you meet other overlanders, is around a campfire.
That's a good point.
I don't really have a lot of time for overlanders, to be fair.
You've got more time, but so far.
That sounds fabulous.
Let's do that.
Let's just take a second to appreciate the noise of the campfire and the forest.
Crackle, crackle.
If you haven't guessed by the tone of the conversation, you may have realised that we've actually been drinking a few beers around the campfire this evening. And,
for about 2 hours, haven't we?
Yeah, and for the first time in maybe 4 podcasts, we are actually all in the same room, which is quite unique, because all the podcasts I've been doing previously have been via Skype.
Oh, wow.
And the sound quality has been dubious at best. So the sound quality on this one will be pretty intense. So I can hear you slugging your beer every time you take a sip.
Make sure don't slurp.
Hyper reality. Anyway, if you could introduce yourselves, please.
So I am Ed Gill. Last year, or between June 2015 and June 2016, so just over the course of the year, I rode solo overland by motorbike from London to Sydney. And prior to that, I also rode from Buenos Aires to Lima over 10 weeks in early 2015, which seems a long time ago now.
Before that journey came to a crashing halt.
Before I had an argument with a Peruvian minibus on the wrong side of the road. Yes.
My name is Jon Beardmore. I drove a Toyota Land Cruiser called Boris, along with my mascot Kiwi Ted, from London to Kuala Lumpur and back again from April 2013 to January 2014.
Okay, so 2 very different modes of transport. Very similar routes though. Like, I'm sure we all passed through similar countries.
Jon at this point is probably the claim that I copied him, probably in some shape or form.
Well, no, you your bike was so, ropey that it could only go in one direction, whereas I was able to turn around and come back again with my car.
It was falling apart towards the end. But I think actually it's interesting, because watching and I think I knew this anyway, but watching the film that you made about your trip and your reference to Peter Hopkirk and the Great Game book that you read as well was also a book that I read. The reason why I read that was because I'd studied at university Central Asia, which kind of really got my interest in the area, kind of ignited, I would say, all these crazy dictators doing things like the guy, I can't remember the guy in Turkmenistan who renamed February after his mother just because he fancied it, basically.
Yeah.
Or the president of Uzbekistan who kicked out Coca-Cola for a while because the president of Coca-Cola used to be married to his daughter and then in Uzbekistan and then divorced her or something like that. So I think that probably was the main thing that kind of pricked my interest in it initially. Yeah.
And then, Ed, you just mentioned that Jon had been making a film, and actually Jon and I have been in contact for quite some time because he had been following our trip and then ultimately I had also been following his trip. And this is the first time we've actually met
After stalking you for 4 years or so now, I finally tracked you down.
Yeah. And like I'm really interested to see your film. But what came first? Did you have the idea of making the film, or did you have the concept of doing this trip, and then did you have a light bulb moment when you went, yeah, I can make a film out of this? What came first?
It's very much the journey. I think if you wind it back a bit, it was actually 2010 and 11 when I was in South America travelling, and I decided that I needed to do journeys that had more of a purpose to them, and that I was inspired by adventure and travel and exploration, and started to move away from the sort of humdrum backpacking, getting boozed up around treks. So I came back from that journey going, right, what do I want to do now? I want to do something that's exciting but that has a purpose to the journey, and Central Asia had caught my mind. It was the continent that I was looking to explore, and I'd been to Afghanistan once before, so I wanted to go back. And so I set about planning to do the journey, and I had no idea about overlanding, what was involved. I just decided I would go and I would figure it all out. And it was about a year or so after I'd been planning. I was about 6 months from going, and I'd been mulling the idea of filming because I was interested in the idea of doing it and trying to produce something, but I didn't kind of know what was involved. But I had an inkling that it was going to be quite a significant impact on the journey itself. So I thought about it for quite a long time, and then I decided, when am I ever going to get a better story to tell than a journey through here that has a historical relevance from a couple of hundred years ago to today, and also has the unique aspect of playing a couple of games of cricket in Afghanistan, which was something that I'd done myself. So I thought, right, I'll give it a go, and we'll see how it unfolds.
Yeah, and I liked your kind of blasé approach to it. The fact that you were just like, yeah, I'll give it a go and see what happens. And I think that's something that is something Ed and I were talking about before we started recording earlier. That even people who you think are incredibly professional at what they do, like I researched and followed loads of people and thought, yeah, man, look at these guys, they know what they're doing, they're really professional. And you said the same thing before, regarding someone else. That's one thing I should have mentioned before we start. We have to be careful not to say anything liable.
It wasn't liable, that's what I said.
Ed Gill is a handsome man.
But,
he is, ladies, he is.
But that kind of whole jumping in at the deep end and just literally getting on with it is something that I found happens across the board. And no matter how professional you think an overlander is and how experienced they are, they generally are winging it most of the time.
I completely agree with that, and I think you can go into, despite you taking the mick out of me, Jon, I did do some planning, or a fair bit of planning for my trip.
We still have no evidence of that.
Yeah, I do. I've got an Excel spreadsheet somewhere. It's really colourful.
Wasn't it the one that I gave you?
No. Fancy formulas and everything. But I think actually I did some planning before I went. I probably didn't plan as much as some people did. But I did a fair amount of planning. But I found that actually as time went on and I became more experienced, the need for that planning dropped away as well, because you learn how to do things on a very kind of by the seat of your pants kind of basis, which you kind of have to do. You learn to do that on the road, because ultimately you can make the best plan in the world, but there's so much stuff that's just out of your control. Then there's all the unknown unknowns that you're just never going to predict are going to happen. So you learn to deal with that, I think, and that's I guess the one way that you do things, and you are winging it, and you accept that you're not going to get it right, and you accept it's going to be. I think the way I described my trip on the final blog that I wrote about it was that it was perfectly imperfect. It took me 12 months, it was meant to take me 6 months. The route was completely different to what I anticipated, or at least probably a quarter of it was. And that's kind of, I think, the way you've got to view things at the end of it.
But certainly, I remember looking through your blog, and right from the off, you said it's funny because Jon was talking about a purpose to a trip, which typically is what an expedition is about. It's about having a purpose for that particular travel. But I remember looking at your blog and saying that you were out for an adventure, and you certainly got that adventure. And you don't get an adventure by planning, I don't think. Certainly the adventure comes in all the unknowns, and when your trip goes wrong in all the right ways. I stole that quote from Paul Crittenden from an earlier podcast. It was a good one, I liked it. But certainly, how did you find? Did you plan a lot before you left, Jon?
Yeah, I quite like planning. I love the research aspect of a trip, but even the trip that I did was so big and so complex. I needed to do some, because once again, the decision to share the story both by blogging and by filming, and that decision to film meant that if I was going to produce something that I was going to be happy with and proud with, I had to complete my journey, and it had to kind of work. And I chose a ridiculously ambitious route by trying to drive all the way out and all the way back, and I find out why most people don't really do that, because it is quite complex in the time frames that you have. So I enjoyed it. I love doing it, but I'm with you guys as well, right? I'll put a plan together because I like doing it. I like to have an idea. But then I'm not religiously set in stone to that plan. I like to understand my options, so that when I get somewhere, if a better idea comes up, I've got the opportunity to take advantage of that. I think that's the openness about it. And why, if you're not time dependent, you've got flexibility in your schedule, you can roll along quite merrily and sort things as you go. That's totally doable. If you're on a tight time schedule, like I had some deadlines to make certain borders where I just couldn't miss them, then I, as a sort of project management professional, what I do as a job, that element of me comes out, and I want to make sure that I've covered my bases so that I don't make a stupid mistake like fall off my motorbike and get injured racing to get back to make a border or something like that I must achieve. Like you, Ed.
Exactly. That's exactly what I did. The tyre, to be fair, my front tyre had a puncture. I didn't fall off.
How fast were you travelling in your rush to get back to your border?
I was travelling about 50 miles an hour on the way to the Kyrgyz-Chinese border on a Sunday afternoon. And I don't think I told you this story, Andy.
No, I don't know this one.
And I'd already had a water pump fail 48 hours before, which finding a water pump for a Yamaha Tenere in the middle of Kyrgyzstan is pretty much as difficult as you might think it is. Well, it is very difficult, let's put it that way. Luckily I did manage to find one from a rental, the only rental company in that part of the world. So I'd already had a really stressful 48 hours beforehand, managed to get it sorted, got back on the road, was riding, as I say, on the way to the Chinese border to meet a guide and a group which had been arranged over the internet to split the cost of the guide. And when you're doing that many miles, when you're doing, hours and hours a day for months on end, the mind plays tricks with you, particularly on a motorbike. Is something going wrong? Have I got a flat, on the back? What's going on? What's that noise? Is the engine vibrating more than usual? What's that rattle? It happens. And you learn to kind of just, ignore it. But on this occasion, I thought there was something wrong. I wiggled the handlebars. And I thought, there's something wrong like that. I'll just test it. And I came into a right-hand corner. I thought, I'll just test it. Learned a little bit, and the whole bike just gave way underneath me, about 40 to 50 miles an hour, with my right foot underneath it.
Ooh.
So I'd had a puncture in the front wheel.
Yeah.
And that's what had caused it. And it transpired that... so I missed my slot to go to China. Ended up spending 7 weeks in Kyrgyzstan.
How many months you spent planning and putting that trip through China together?
China, well, that was the big thing that I planned out of everything, and to be honest, that framed the time frames for the first part of the trip, and actually, that was probably, that is probably one lesson that I would communicate above anything else to anyone else wanting to do a trip like this type that we've all done, and that is, on a trip like that, I mean, I looked at it as I guess any person from project management point of view would do when you're back in warm and safety at home. You say, okay, what is the one big thing that needs to be organised? What is the one thing that's going to be trickiest to be organised? And that's natural to do that. I think that's what you do. And I looked at the Chinese side of things. I thought, well, I've got to find a group. I've got to do it before the winter passes close for winter. I've got to get visas sorted. I've got to do this. I've got to do that. So I kind of booked that back in May, and this is at the end of September. So that's 6 months out.
Numbers ain't a strong point.
Numbers are not a strong one. My strong point. 4 or 5 months out, and actually there was no need to do that, because what I subsequently found when I had to rebook was that you can just wait. It is better to actually wait, monitor the situation, keep in touch with agencies, keep in touch with what's going on, and hold off making a decision as late as possible, so you don't have that time pressure. And that was one of the things that I really learned. There's one thing making a decision, there's another thing knowing when to make a decision. And that's probably one of the most important things I learned from my trip, from that point of view, from that side of things.
Yeah, I think also when you undertake trips of this kind of length, there are so many parameters which are variables. And for example, if you're meeting a group of 6 other overlanders to travel through China, ultimately they can all have any number of problems the same problems you've experienced. So people aren't going to get the borders at the same time. So I think having that flexibility is also something that's really important, but also taking into consideration all the parameters which are variables which can sway and change your decisions actually as you travel. When you were planning, John, because if you're planning to such a tight time frame, and that there are certain, not everyone has the luxury of time, and people obviously have to return to work or jobs or have commitments elsewhere, or even to make groups to cross China, people have time constraints. But during that whole planning stage, because you organised a lot of your visas before you left, right? The majority of them. I
did. Because I didn't really have a lot of time to apply for them if I wanted to squeeze in as much. Once our Chinese date got set and it got pulled forward because of a group decision on when the date was, it got pulled forward a few weeks earlier than I had ideally wanted it for my departure date. So that once that was set, you worked everything back from there. And I had so many things that I wanted to see in so many countries, and so we ended up about 2.5 months out from departure. I put 8 applications in for visas and got my visa back 2 days, passport back 2 days before I departed, with all 8 to get me all the way to Laos.
Okay.
So that was just finally tuned. But I'd been talking to the visa machine in advance, and we'd mapped this out months before I needed to apply, just so I knew what the time frames were. And then I put it in, and it came together, and it worked perfectly. I mean, I didn't have to worry about any sort of visa stuff all the way out.
So did you use one agent to organise all your visas, or did you organise them independently yourself?
No, I used one agent to do it, and Visa Machine were great. There's others like Travcore and a few others out there, but I actually highly recommend them. The fee that you would pay, the time and effort that they spent doing on it, it was better for me just to go and work, save the money, pay the bill, and then they became an agent of mine on my entire journey. So I was able to call them, deal with them, and they helped me and advised me of any changes throughout my entire journey. And because of the uniqueness of my trip, I had to get a second British passport, leave it in the UK with paperwork, with the agency to start applying for my return visas, which were India, Pakistan and Iran, while I was on the road, because I couldn't apply for them before I left.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because your approach to visas was very different, was by and large different to mine, presumably because you were taking that lot more detailed planning approach.
Didn't have the time.
Yeah,
I didn't have the time to sit around waiting for 6 weeks, or not 6 weeks, but a week to do each visa application and that. And in Pakistan, for example, you have to apply in the UK, so there were certain restrictions that I couldn't get around.
What I found, because I applied for more of mine on the road, some of them I did. I think I had a Russian one, which I didn't use in the end. I was the only visa that I left with, actually, was the Russian visa, was the only one that I had. I applied for most of mine I got most of mine on the road. And what you learn very quickly is that different embassies have, and you must have found this as well, different embassies have different approaches in different countries. So the Chinese embassy in Bishkek might have a completely different policy to Chinese embassy in Tbilisi or somewhere else, for example. So if your trip is about going more about going with the flow, then that's fine. You can do that, but you have to be prepared to be quite patient. But if you do want to take more of a structured approach, can definitely see the value of using an agency like you did, John. Indeed, I ended up using Visa Machine myself after my accident. I needed to get a Pakistan visa, and I was not going to go home to do that. So I needed someone on the other end to handle that, to post my passport home, to do that for me.
The fees are pretty reasonable for the hassle that they remove from you, and then they also have the connections into the embassies to expedite things in a lot of cases. So, I think I spent nearly $2,000 on visas for all of the different places, and maybe a third of that was fees. But if you think, £500 or £600, yep, that's a lot. If you're under time pressure, that was good value money for me. Whereas if you're slow mosey travel like you, Ed, then I'd do it on the road, one at a time. Quite often it's cheaper as well. And if you're prepared to stay in a city for a few days and you're in a hurry, then you don't need to do too many of these in advance.
Well, the other thing I was saying on that, playing the visa game whilst on the road does dictate what route you take quite often, and not just in terms of accessibility, but in terms of where you are to get visas. So to use one example, for me to get I had to get an Azerbaijani visa just so I could get an Uzbek visa, because there was no Uzbek embassy in Georgia, so I had to go to Azerbaijan, potentially to cross the Caspian on a boat, which was my first option, but I was also looking at a reserve option going up through Kazbekian and Georgian Military Highway. But even if I was going to go to the Georgian Military Highway, I would have always had to go through Uzbekistan, in which case I would have always had to go to Azerbaijan to get the Uzbekistan visa. So the whole visa game is just so multifaceted in so many different ways. It's quite good fun if you've got the patience and the tolerance for it and kind of just accept it for what it is, but it's not for everyone, I don't think.
Yeah, I think it's certainly when we travel, we played a similar game to Ed. We picked up our visas pretty much on the road, and the benefits for that, for us in that particular instance, was that we didn't have any time constraints, but we also found that kind of approach meant that you weren't applying pressure on yourself to meet deadlines, because there were certain countries we got to that were just stunning, and because we hadn't actually done much research, we hadn't realised how stunning they were and how amazing the driving was going to be, so we ended up staying longer in those particular countries, and actually getting our visas on the road allowed us to play that game of buying more time here, there, whatever.
It was a good call. I mean, the complexity of my journey, and so what I was trying to do, meant that I didn't actually get to do a lot of the research on the countries that you would do if you were doing a 2-week specific trip to somewhere, right? So I was rocking into countries knowing next to nothing about it, other than if I'd got a Lonely Planet and I'd read about it 2 days beforehand. And so it made it actually quite an amazing experience to go in with almost a blank page to countries and rock up and just be surprised.
I would strongly agree with that point as well, because I fell into the trap at various points in my trip of trying to, say if I've been stuck somewhere for a while, problem with the bike, and my natural instinct, and you sit there twiddling your thumbs like, okay, I'm going to go and read up and research and try and find some cool places to go. That's good and it's great, because you almost want to do that to make sure you don't miss anything particularly major there. But the best stuff is always the stuff that you can't research and you can't plan, in my opinion. It's always the stuff that you kind of you can't prepare for it in a way. Some of the best experiences because it's the randomness of it as well.
Yeah. Incidentally, Ed, where do you keep your massive stash of Lonely Planets on your motorbike?
I had them on the e-book. I got e-books. I had quite a few. The Central Asia one hadn't been updated since 2008. I'm personally quite cynical about Lonely Planets. The example I like to give is the South American one. I have to be careful about saying something libelous here, clearly, but the South American one where it says you go to so-and-so village with adobe houses and you turn up and find that there's a very confused Argentine local with an emaciated goat tied to a post, wondering what the hell's going on, with about 50 backpackers sitting up to take a photo. And
allegedly,
and it's and it's. I think a mixture of sources is always good. I think Lonely Planets, in my opinion, can be a bit hit and miss, but that's my personal opinion. It comes down to what you want from a trip, ultimately.
Yeah.
I think a mixture of Lonely Planets, Wiki Travel, TripAdvisor, and also just seeing perhaps where other travellers have been as well before you.
Yeah.
People did certain
I think certainly that network and the fruition of the internet certainly helps the way we travel. Like, there's absolutely no way on earth I can imagine planning a trip like this like 15, 20 years ago. Maybe 15, 20. But they did, yeah, people did. Yeah. And I think what's probably reassuring for people who may be listening to the podcast who are potentially planning a trip like this is in pretty much every podcast I've released so far, with maybe the exception of one or two, generally everyone is flying by the seat of their pants. Yeah. Like, they have, a lot of the time... Yeah, well, it goes back to what we said right at the very beginning. Yeah. Like, people think they're professional travellers, but they're not. It's like, half the time we're winging it, and I think that must be quite reassuring for people who are planning a trip.
I think so. I think one of the things that I took away from the Adventure Travel Film Festival this year, which John and I were both at. John was showboating his movie premiere, living up the red carpet lifestyle.
Yeah, I'm rich and famous now. Without the rich and out the famous.
It's all about the way the film selection was curated. One of the main things I took away is the way the film selection was created. It was all about people who outwardly they might actually have looked like they're hardcore adventurers, but actually when you watch the film you realise they don't know what they're doing. They're winging it. They're just like, right, we're just going to give it a crack. And I think that's very true. I think, John, obviously that was your experience.
People have just, I think the common trait is curiosity and adventurous, and want to go and explore and find out for yourselves, right, what a place is like, and not just rely on the media, which misleads, isn't really consistent. Stories change, doesn't really necessarily represent a place correctly. And you go and find out for yourself, and once you've kind of got that bug and you've done it a few times, you want to keep doing it. And so you go, right, I'm going to go and check it out, and I'm going to figure out what's involved. Yeah. Once I've decided I'm going to go.
One thing that's really interesting is something you just raised there, that the media portrayal of a country, but the media portrayal of a country will always be political. The media portrayal will never deal with the people at ground level. Say, for example, you may get it to some degree now, where if they're reporting on the war in Syria, they will take people and use them as like a case study and try and explain what's happening to the people and why they're moving and why we're in this situation. But certainly something like the film you've made, which is always something that people we meet on the road will reiterate, is that especially when we're in Iran, the people of Iran will always go home and tell people in your country what we're really like. And the people in Iran, as we all know, are some of the most amazing, friendly people you'll ever meet. But in the West, we only ever get the media portrayal of that. So was that an intention when you set out to make your film, to show the rest of the world, the people you meet on your travels, are just like you and me. At ground level, that we're all the same.
Yep, pretty much. I've travelled. Anybody who's travelled, we all have those positive experiences, and I've been in cases and countries where you see negativity on the news, and then when you look out the front door, you don't see it at all. And the media tends to focus on small, isolated incidents and locations and blow it out of proportion, or that's all you see from that country. And so people don't ask the question, is that actually the whole true story for a particular country? And that country can get stereotyped with that particular approach, and then you think the whole country's on fire and falling apart.
Yeah.
And you'll find that it's one little spot that's had some troubles, and you could go to any country in this entire world, in most cities and places, and there'll be a shitty place somewhere where some shit are going down. Now, if you apply that rule, the whole world is basically buggered.
Yeah.
But we know, and I guess I knew this, and my suspicions were that Central Asia would be similar. But we see nothing but quite a negative storytelling that coming out of that region, and so I wanted to go and explore it, and I asked the question, is Central Asia a dangerous place? And I wanted to find out for myself, and then share that both through social media, through blogging, and then the film has been the piece that's come afterwards, the return of the trip. But while I was travelling live, I was trying to blog and share and show people that as I was travelling through these places, I was having a wonderful time. The people were amazing, and I wasn't, seeing any of the trouble that people might associate with these places.
But do you think there's a danger in that, though? Because there are certain pockets of these countries where that danger does actually exist and is actually a reality for a lot of people. Generally, a lot of those times it's very isolated. But do you think there's a danger in encouraging other people to potentially travel to these countries, or do you have advice? What would your advice basically be to other people who are potentially planning a trip like this to stay safe?
Well, look, you do your research on the countries. You can look at the Foreign and Commonwealth site. I believe you probably have to take that with a pinch of salt, because they always go with worst case scenario. I went through 6 locations that the FCO website said avoid at all costs. Not a problem whatsoever. And I think things, you might go through an area that's had troubles, but it's not going to have troubles 24/7 every day. You're going to travel through these places, and generally you'd have to do something pretty stupid to get yourself caught up in something.
Yeah.
So you need to take a pragmatic approach, do a little bit of research, but it's speaking to the local people on the ground.
Yeah.
They will put you in the right direction, and then if something doesn't look right, you start, I think over time you develop a little bit of a gut instinct for something doesn't feel right, and you just avoid it. You go a different way, and you just don't take any risks. And I travelled through Pakistan, which I had to have police escorts, but they were there to look after me, and I just put my faith in them, and they escorted me through. So if there's a place that's actually truly bad, there's actually normally somebody there keeping an eye out for somebody to accidentally wander in by accident and say, hold on, turn around, and off go back the other way.
That was certainly my experience of it as well. The FCO advice is always, first of all, as John said, it's geared towards worst case scenario. It's also designed for such a vast range of people. The people writing it are not thinking about people necessarily who want to drive 4x4 or ride a motorbike to these places. They're thinking about 2.4 children family. Do they want to take them there? Because that's what it's geared towards. Because I think that's probably what is the common kind of denominator, if you like. So I think that's the first point on that. And the second point on it is it's geared towards the risk of something happening as well. Not necessarily whether something's bad happening there and then. It's like there's a risk that something might happen as well. And my experience in Pakistan was the same as yours, John. From what you're saying, I found that quite a few of my friends were very worried about Pakistan. I didn't, in fact, tell my mother that I went to Pakistan. I said to her that I went to northwest British India, which is technically incorrect because Pakistan was British India.
So you went back in time to 1947.
And when I sent her an item of local clothing as a Christmas present, I said to her that it was from the Himalayas and not from the Karakorums. But anyway,
what did your mother say when she found out about this?
She just gave me a very disapproving look, but she didn't know the fact that I broke my foot until I think a month after I came home as well. So anyway, I've lost my point now. I think learning to understanding to get information on the ground is probably almost more important. The SEO stuff is a starting point, right? Then you've got, perhaps, if you are able to follow blogs of anyone who's gone through any particular sensitive areas before you. I know, for example, there's an Australian father and son team who'd gone through Pakistan only 2 or 3 weeks before I did. I think one of the boy was aiming to become the world's youngest Earth Roamers. That's their blog called, the youngest guy, youngest person to circumnavigate the world on a motorbike. So I could see that. And then finally, when you get there on the ground, it's about local law enforcement. Actually, a lot of it is about having to learn your gut instinct, and if you're speaking to someone, if you're speaking to a sergeant or someone, member of the police or the army, how do you feel about this person? What's the vibe that they're giving off? And you've got to develop that. I mean, you can develop that, and I think I certainly felt like that's one of the things that I learned over my time when I was on the road, certainly. And you develop that instinct, and I think you find that stuff is generally pretty good. I mean, I don't know. I would say, though, I've never been to Africa, and I think something like Africa is probably slightly different. I think that's... But once again, I was speaking to someone who had just recently come back from Africa last weekend, who'd been doing a big kayaking trip out there, and her view was that a lot of it is once again overblown.
Yeah.
It's ignorance a little bit. We don't know enough. Once you start doing a bit of research about something, your risk levels will come down.
Yeah.
And it's just knowledge. When you don't know anything and all you see is you remember something on the news that was negative, that can form an impression on you until you've learned a little bit more. Go, okay, that's a part of the country you don't go to, or whatever like that.
Yeah.
Spend a bit of time, do a bit of research, and then your understanding grows.
You do generally find. I mean, what I found is those places which were really sensitive. So in Pakistan, for example, there was no way I could have gone to anywhere near Peshawar or the Khyber Pass. The police just thought they wouldn't have let me go anywhere near that. And I knew that from speaking to local people. I asked 2 or 3 different local people, and they said exactly the same thing. The police will not let you through, certainly as a Westerner. So there is a bit, trusting local security as well, and reading that correctly.
I think certainly that's certainly true to some degree. Like we travelled up through the Georgian military highway the second time we left, and into Russia, then through that area of Russia into Kazakhstan, and that area is quite politically sensitive, and we actually had time to kill because we had a Russian transit visa, which basically gave us 5 days to get through Russia into Kazakhstan, but it was days specific, and we had we weren't sure what the weather was going to be like up through the Georgian military highway, so we left a day or two early, and we had a day to kill. So we decided, we looked on the map, spotted a nice valley, thought, let's go driving up there, we'll go see. Emma was interested in doing some bird watching. We literally got maybe 2 or 3 miles up the valley, and then from nowhere the military just descended, and we were like, where did all these people go? There's lots of people with guns.
Listening to your stories, Andy, you seem to attract a lot of trouble.
Well, we're curious, but actually they were there for our protection. They were just wanted to make sure that we didn't wander off into any area that we shouldn't have wandered into, and all they did was double check our passports and basically tell us, you shouldn't venture any further. Probably best if you turn around. We showed them the bird book. Got the binoculars out.
Two birds in the bush, eh? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
But I think as a result of that, and that's obviously just one example, and there are typically as you travel in this manner, there are lots of examples which I could cite which are very similar to that. But one thing it's made me really aware of is just general world politics. Is that something that you would say you've got more of an interest in now, because you've travelled in this way?
I would say, for me, I've always had an interest in current affairs and international affairs, particularly. I've also worked, not in international affairs, but I've worked in politics myself. So it's something which I've got a natural interest in. I would say I've learned to view things in a different way. So I can think of two examples. First of all, I was in Pakistan, and I remember it was in Sost, the town just over the border, the first town over the border from China, and I was in this rundown trucker hotel, basically, -9 at night, -9 at night, no heating, sleeping all your gear and your sleeping bag, all that sort of stuff. There's a TV on, and there's a guy there who is, an Al Qaeda guy who is speaking on the TV, and all the local people are watching it. And you speak to local people, and what frustrates them about a lot of the issues we have about perhaps the West is the fact that we take such a black and white view of the subject. It's not necessarily a deep ideological divide in terms of one religion against the other. It's that frustration that was communicated to me is the fact that you guys seem so willing to take such a simplistic view, but we don't want to take a simplistic view. And I thought that was really interesting, and that was just one conversation back of a TV show that I was watching. The second thing was actually in Southeast Asia, and I remember I studied the Vietnam War, like most of us, or a lot of us at school, and Laos and Cambodia were two countries that I travelled through, and what really struck me was, how much in the West you naturally view, say, communism from the Western standpoint. That is, we're used to having a certain standard of living, and communism brings down that standard of living. That's the general view, which is probably a mainstream view, I think, amongst a lot of people. But when you actually go to those countries and you understand, you see for the first time what standard of living is and how much lower it is than your own standard of living, then you can understand why they might view communism or, say, a different political ideology very different to how you might do as well. So I thought that was really interesting as well. I'm not saying my views particularly shifted on that, but I'm saying I can understand how to view things in a slightly different way as a result of that.
And what's interesting about what you say there is, if you were to then place your own perspective of that whole situation onto them, well, basically, I'll ask you a very simple question. How warmly were you welcomed in Laos and Cambodia as a white person?
Very well, didn't have any trouble at all.
Yeah.
No trouble at all. I didn't have any... I never once feared for my security on the whole trip. The only time I feared for my safety on the whole trip was 72 hours before the end in Australia, when I got stuck overnight in a national park with very little water. I got lost at dusk. I'd been riding when I shouldn't have been. I'd been camping for 2 or 3 nights, so I'd been soaked to the skin for the preceding 48 hours. And I was stuck on a trail. I was 8 miles from the nearest town. I would have followed a trail down that I couldn't get out of.
Yeah.
Or I thought I couldn't get out of because it was dark. And long story short, then I was genuinely scared.
Yeah.
And the differentiator was that I didn't want to, perhaps was that I really didn't want to be there. But ultimately, at that time, because I think the trip has reached the end, but actually, before that, I'd never felt really unsafe about anything, really. Even in Pakistan, when you're getting an armed escort on and off the bike, everywhere you go, from the border all the way down, from the Chinese border down to Pakistan, down to Islamabad.
And even in that circumstances, when you were fearful, they're circumstances that aren't related to other people.
Exactly. It's my personal
your own
reaction.
stupidity.
Yeah, no, it was. I made a stupid mistake, and I was tired, I was run down, I didn't want to be there. So it wasn't related to other people. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I know. What I found amazing travelling through Southeast Asia and learning so much about the history. Like we studied the Vietnam War in secondary school, but really minimal, and I was unaware of basically the situation in Laos, and like with all the heavy US bombing that had happened, and everywhere we went, we were welcomed with open arms before people would even find out where we were from. And we could have been American for all they knew. And you know, they can't differentiate between my English accent and American accent. They know what language I'm speaking, maybe, but
what one interesting point is, though, is that on a few occasions, only a few, or maybe only a couple of occasions, I found that one nationality would warn me against the other. Which is interesting. Which says something about national dividing.
Well, typically every country we went to, especially through Eastern Europe, every country we were in would warn you about the next country. Oh, you don't trust the people in that country, they're terrible.
Well, the first place I go,
you get there and you're just like, well, they're saying the same about you, mate.
the first place I found quite that was on the Azerbaijani border, where I met a very just from going Georgian to Azerbaijan, and the border guard was very well turned out. And it's like, have you been to Armenia? I think, well, I had been. I said yes. And he was like, Armenia are our enemy. So it was told in very forthright terms. That was probably the most amusing time. But I did find that on another occasion. I think going from Malaysia into Indonesia, and the people on the Malaysian side were like, "Oh, the Indonesians are all X, Y, Z." And they got to the Indonesian side, and they're like, "Oh, the Malaysians are all X, Y, Z." So I mean, it's I guess it's just a fault of human nature, I guess, in a way.
But it's something it's something that I found interesting. I read on your website, John, that it was. I think there was a quote. I read this a long time ago, so I'm probably going to get it wrong. But it was essentially one of the reasons why you wanted to make a film was that just to explain to the world that ultimately we are all just people and we're all the same and we have a shared common goal. And that's one thing that I think is a reason why a lot of people undertake trips like this, is they may suspect it. Like before we left on our trip, we had heard so many stories about the people from Iran just being amazing people. And I think a little bit of me wanted to go there for myself just to see if all the rumours I'd heard were true, or just to kind of confirm, like, just to reinforce my belief in humanity, I think, to some degree. Was that something that, I don't know, I guess I'm asking the same question I asked you just before when you were talking about the goals of your film. It's something that you wanted to do and tell the rest of the world.
Well, it was the goals of the trip, really, just to go and explore and do my own research, find out for myself rather than let other people form my opinions, form your own yourself. And the best education I can think of in the world is to go actually out and explore and meet the people and talk to them and ask them about what's it like for them, and you learn so much more than you could ever do from a book or a news article or something like that by talking to people on the ground. And everywhere I go, I find people friendly, warm, generous, helpful, funny, and you just, it repeats itself over and over again. So I'm just coming to the conclusion that we're all just the same. Every country, you were highlighting before, don't go to that country, they're all full of mad guys going to kill you. And then when you get there, right, they're going like, where did you come from? I came from the other place. Oh my God, I can't believe you got out of there alive. There's just something stupid about human nature, but fundamentally you meet somebody in the right frame of mind and the timing and everything, and as a tourist it makes it very easy as an icebreaker when you go into countries, that people are just more relaxed in themselves. And everywhere I've gone, all the countries, everybody has been bloody well very friendly. So you think, well, there's a trend here. The world is the same everywhere around. We're all humans. We all want to hang out with our mates. We want to hang out with our family. We want to have a good time. We don't want to deal with any shit. And it's a very, very small portion that are, causing all the havoc in the world. And that actually the vast majority of the world, we're all the same.
Yeah. It's fascinating though, isn't it, when you look at a map and you look at a country's borders and you think about the particular history of that country and what that country's gone through to get to where it is. And there have been times when we've crossed land borders where you can kind of see the physicality of the land has really dictated that particular border. And one that was really quite obvious was crossing from Russia into Mongolia. Literally, yeah, like as soon as you got to the border of Mongolia and you're on the road south to Ulaanbaatar, the landscape was Mongolia, like what you would stereotypically say was Mongolia. Like it was.
What you mean? So the change from one geography to the other was so marked.
Yeah, it was so, and you were like, you could understand that was the natural border between that country and this country because the physical differences between the landscapes were literally, within it was weird. It was almost like in 100-meter stretch.
Mountain ranges, rivers, but all the geographical layout of the earth actually has formed the countries in a lot of places.
And one which is really interesting, which I know we've all travelled, is up in the Pamirs, where you're literally travelling along the border of the river that separates Afghanistan from Tajikistan. Down the Wakhan Valley, and that really is a stunning piece of landscape. Like I had never witnessed anything like that before.
Yeah, you got a Hindu Kush in particular in the distance. I remember that's my favourite memories of the Hindu Kush in the distance, and you could see it was very. I think it must have been very windy because it was almost like it was almost had this hazy dust cloud on it. That was amazingly beautiful. But what I thought, notwithstanding what we were just saying about people's attitude wherever you go, I think that divide does extend to cultural divides as well in terms of borders as well. So the best example is when you go from Turkey to Georgia. So having gone from Greece to Turkey to Georgia, so you go through Greece, which is obviously very European or very very much a westernised Christian-based society. Then you go to Turkey, where it's obviously largely Islamic, and then you go to Georgia. And when you go to Georgia, it's a little bit like going back to Greece very quickly because it's a Christian-based society. Once again, I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure, is it Russian Orthodox maybe? So it's similar to Greek Orthodox in that respect. And so that was probably the most obvious example that I saw of that, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, and the difference actually, Georgia and Armenia were really interesting countries for me because they were seemingly pockets of Europe.
Yeah.
If really very far Eastern Europe, outside of Europe, they were. That difference was really quite strange.
Tbilisi and Georgia consider themselves the Paris of the East.
Yeah.
You ever hear that when you're through there?
No, but a nice city.
Gorgeous. I mean, it was.
Absolutely stunning.
I mean, it was one of the just untold surprises on it. The journey of this, I came over the Kazbegi mountain range at the beginning of spring, and the drive down into Tbilisi is gorgeous, down through the valleys with the rivers running past, the birds were singing. I was just thinking, wow, I had no idea. And a mate of mine had lived in Georgia for 3 or 4 years working out there, and I thought he was in the back blocks of nowhere. And this was a gorgeous country, very well organised, set up beautiful boulevards in the city, just absolutely just surprised really, and I probably kicked myself a bit because that's a little bit arrogant to think that these places are going to be rubbish and without actually having done research.
I don't think that's arrogant. I think that's ultimately the opinion that you form from it, from the news and the information that you've had made available to you, I guess, in a way.
I just didn't know anything about it. I hadn't done any research. Hadn't even looked at a picture of what Georgia might look like.
Yeah. Well, that kind of level of naivety as well is certainly something we experienced. Like in 2011, if someone had said to me, you've got 5 seconds to point to Georgia on a map, I'd be like, it's around there somewhere roughly, and I probably would be about 2,000 miles out. Because certainly those countries in Central Asia, certainly Georgia and Armenia, and all the stands, certainly from a Western viewpoint, there was one American politician whose name I can't remember, who was maybe an American Secretary of State somewhere
Rumsfeld?
along the line. Not, yeah, possibly.
Was it the known unknowns quote that you're thinking of?
Possibly, where he basically made up a new stand.
Oh no, that's a different quote. I don't know about that one.
There was one American politician who was talking about a situation in Central Asia, and he just made up a new stand. It's like,
They are all different. This is the
Durkistan, Team America.
Yeah, this is the thing I found fascinating. Is that if you take the former Soviet, I mean, if you exclude Pakistan and focus on the former Soviet countries, by which I mean the southern former Soviet countries. So if you include Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, I didn't go to Turkmenistan, so I can't comment about that. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Of all those countries, the two countries with the most developed democracies are Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. The two countries with the most liberalised economies are Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. And what I found fascinating is that out of all those countries, those two were the most similar. Yeah, and their political institutions and economic organisation seem most similar in that sense. I mean, Georgia's probably a bit more liberal than Kyrgyzstan. In fact, a lot more liberal, I think, than Kyrgyzstan. And what's really interesting is that they're both putting on a really strong pitch for tourism, for international tourism. They both see themselves as the future of tourism in those areas. Kyrgyzstan is styling itself as the Central Asian Switzerland, or Switzerland of Central Asia. I'm not sure what Georgia is styling itself as, but it's certainly got a big push on there to get people in doing a lot of hiking in the Caucasus Mountains in the north of the country. The Ministry of Tourism seems to be bending over backwards to be helping to make it as easy as possible to get there. And there's, well-established systems of homestays, community-based tourism, all that sort of stuff. And I thought that was really interesting that those two countries had followed quite similar paths when the others had taken, it was, as we met in Uzbekistan, for example, and that's a country where I've never been to a country where it feels stale almost in terms of the level of economic development, because the same guy, although he's passed on now, Karamov has passed on now, the same guy who was running it when we were there was the same guy who was running it when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So they are all different in their own right, and even they've all gone. Even with these same guys in charge, they've all gone their own different ways in various shapes and forms.
But all very unique countries, and really quite curious countries. And I certainly had preconceived notions about every one of those countries, which was seemingly massively incorrect.
Yeah.
Even down to the geography of the country and how the people looked. I was miles out on every front. And travelling through that region was one of my favourite areas to travel. And I can see why that area has now become really quite desirable to overlanders, especially, well, not so much now, but certainly when we left in 2012, 2013, 2014, trying to pick a clean route north to south through Africa on either side was becoming increasingly difficult. Even politically, the road conditions were improving and it was becoming easier technically to drive that route, but the political situation was quite bad. So I can see why overlanders were kind of heading to Central Asia at that point.
The main problem is bureaucratic for Central Asia. It's visas. As we've talked about, it's not necessarily security, really. I mean, not that I found at all, even along the Wakhan Valley, going along the Afghan border. You sit there and you stop for a brew right by the Wakhan River. And,
nothing.
There's not even any troops around. I mean, there's a troop at a checkpoint every so often, but I mean, it's nothing major. It's nothing like.
Yeah. Well, we travelled down there and we really wanted to cross into Afghanistan at Ishkashim to go to the market, and the afternoon we arrived, it was quite tense in Ishkashim. It was a little bit uncomfortable, and then we discovered that there had actually been like a shooting in Ishkashim and the Afghan side during the day, which basically meant they closed the border, so we weren't able to cross. But you crossed to that border, right, John?
Yeah, I came down to the market. They have a famous market on Saturday mornings. There's an Ishkashim in Turkmenistan, or Tajikistan, and there's a Ishkashim in Afghanistan, and they have a market in the middle right on the border. And we went to that. Everybody comes from both countries and they sell their wares. It's a fun thing to do. And then, I crossed over in. Going to Afghanistan was a big part of my trip. I wanted to go all the way up to the top of the Wakhan corridor, and I didn't have any problems. There was security and I had to do paperwork, but I had a guide. That was one of the countries where I'd gone to the extra effort to hire a guide to make sure that everything ran smoothly, because I wanted to go all the way up the valley. I could have done it by myself, but it would have just taken longer and been more of a hassle.
How did it work with the guy? Did you pick him up and he sat in your car? And
yeah, it was. I'd made some contacts with a guy working. There was a wildlife organisation in the Wakhan corridor, and I got in touch with him, and he'd then by somebody else, and he'd then passed me on to a couple of people he knew that would help with the letter of invitation for the visa, and then they also arranged for somebody to meet me at the border to make sure I could get through okay. Now, turned out that guy, Fahad, he was helping me then, said, right, I want to hire a guy. He helped me conduct interviews. I conducted interviews with 3 local guys for the role, because Western tourist coming in was dollar signs for a very struggling part of the region. And in the end, I said to Farah, mate, your English is great. You're way better than these guys. Will you come on my trip with me? And he checked with his boss, could he take the week off? And he came up, and it was brilliant. He was awesome. He knew a lot about it. He had family and friends up the valley. He knew how the whole system worked. We stopped in at a few places that I knew where things were happening, and I met different people. And we had, in this very short week, we had an amazing experience.
So did you essentially travel north up the other side of the river?
Yeah,
I pretty much followed the river.
I drove up to Sarhad, which is the furthest point that you can drive up in between the Pamir and the Karakoram mountain ranges. So you kind of had Tajikistan on one side, Pakistan and China all surrounding you, and just absolutely spectacular. And the goal was to actually drive as far up as I could and actually play a game of cricket. Because back in 2009, I'd been part of the first cricket team to tour Afghanistan and play the national side in Kabul. And so it was only appropriate that I go back and play another game of cricket when I was in Afghanistan. But this one was with village kids in the middle of the most amazing scenery. We sketched out a bit of a pitch, and we had a game involving 28 kids.
Do you know what altitude that was at? Because I know that whole region is pretty high.
I don't know. I mean, it's got to be probably the first and only game of cricket in northeastern Afghanistan.
Did you go through a different exit, or did you go through the same exit?
Same exit.
Entrance.
In and out. Yeah.
And
I came from Korog south, because I'd come from Dushanbe and drove all the way along the Oxus River, which is amazing scenery, all the way to Korog, then down to Iskashin, crossed over, went up the Wakhan Valley and back in a week, and then came out and then drove back and continued along the Pamir Highway.
Very good curry house in Korog. Don't know if you discovered it. There's an excellent tikka masala as well, believe it or not.
There's curry houses everywhere in that part of the world.
Did you find an Irish one?
No. But the thing that I found in Korog, which is, it's very close to the Afghan border, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a few kilometres away. It was a curry house. And because everyone gathers, as we talked about earlier, people tend to gather, all the overlanders driving or riding the Pamir, cycles, 4x4s and motorbikes, gather in the Pamir Lodge, which is a fantastic place to meet other people and share information about what's going on. And we found a curry house, and it served a tikka masala, which is, British curry dish, obviously. So I had a tikka masala.
Take the British boy out of there. Indian curry.
In my defence, John, I'd had food poisoning for a week before, and it was the first meal that I could hold down. So you know what?
A curry was the
so I decided to go for a classic CTL.
There's that wisdom and.
It worked out fine, so
on a completely different train of thought, actually, and the conversation we've just been having. I don't want to lower it to the gutter, but if you're on your motorbike, like, I've been quite ill when we've been travelling, and there's been times where I've ended up having to go to the bathroom, you know, at least maybe 20 times in a 24-hour period. If you're on your motorbike and you've got all your gear on, problematic?
Well, first of all, I'm probably a little bit naughty. I don't necessarily wear all the gear. I tend to ride quite light. So, but no, I think I always, if you know, I tend to have a loo roll with me, and I think it's just about finding somewhere suitably subtle. I think to go. It happened to me twice, actually, really quite badly. First time was riding up onto the Pamier from Osh up to you know the big lake Caracol.
Yeah,
it is.
It's beautiful.
I did that in an afternoon. That was a mistake. So
Yeah,
that was
900
metres to 4,500 metres in an afternoon.
Yeah.
And because I've been in South America and I dealt with the altitude not too badly, I thought I'd be all right this time. So I did it. And lo and behold, out of breath, spinning headache. But then I also had been a bit feeling woozy when I'd left Osh, but I thought I'd just crack on anyway. And the next thing I know, I've got a fever. I'm in this beautiful homestay with this crazy Russian biker called Ivan, who was there to hunt Marco Polo sheep, which is obviously illegal, but that's what he was there to do.
Did you see any?
I didn't see any, but he'd been waiting for 3 days.
Oh, we saw some. We were really lucky, yeah, but like way off in the distance. You could just see them walking up a ridge. And then where we camped, typically Emma gets up really early in the morning and goes bird watching, and I'd like to sleep. And she had gone off walking up the valley and gone maybe another 500 metres in altitude up the valley. And then she came back a couple of hours later and was like, do you want to come up here? There's something really, really cool. And I was like, oh, I've just woken up. It better be worth it. So I ended up walking all the way up the valley, and literally it must have happened either that evening or the day before. A Marco Polo sheep had fallen and broken its leg. But what was incredible was the fact it was being devoured by vultures. And it was in the base of a valley in a little stream.
Yeah.
And the vultures were on either side and just covered in blood. And the Marco Polo sheep are big sheep.
Yeah.
And they were literally in the middle of devouring it, and we were just like, she's like, you need to crawl. So we're crawling up this little valley, and we disturbed them, and they took off and flew. And then she just made me lie on the floor for about like an hour and a half, 2 hours until they came back. And she was like watching. She was like, "It's amazing, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, it is pretty amazing."
You don't feel a bit squeezy after seeing all that?
No, it was interesting. It was really like I'd never witnessed anything like that, and to see that kind of behaviour from animals, like you know, just it was just nature, and that's something that's really interesting about that part of the world is that the power of nature up there is just obvious everywhere. In the size of the mountains, in how windy it is, in how raging the river is, it's really quite humbling.
It is. Humbling is a really good way of describing it, and I've struggled to describe it too. I met a friend in Almaty after I finished riding the Pamier, and I said to her that was the most amazing experience of the trip so far, and she was like, "Why? How?" And you struggle to explain it. And one way, the way I described it to her at the time, and I'm reluctant to use this word because it's too negative, but it's the dramatic brutality almost. It's a very brutal landscape up there. It's like the moon in many ways. It's very desolate. The distances between towns is often hundreds of kilometres. It can be very cold. It can be, it's a very harsh environment, but very beautiful as well at the same time. I fell in love completely with Pamier. Every so often I keep coming up with ideas. I've made at least one inquiry to see if we can hire a motorbike to go back next year for 2 or 3 weeks.
I know who can help you with that. Dan Spollenbrook.
That's who I've spoken to already.
Did you ever have? I had Boris, my Land Cruiser, would overheat when it went further. So the top of the Pamier, the highest point at 6,000 meters or something like that. It was like blah, 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 and I'd have to actually stop and let. And I found through there, and also through on the way to Osh and so on like that, at that height, it actually affected my cooling system in the truck.
Did it?
Was it just the cooling system? Because
Just the radiator would just be overheating, bubbling away. And it had coolant in it and everything, and I just have to leave it for 20 minutes.
Because our cooling system was fine up there, but what we really noticed was a massive lack of power, and our car just smoked
I
like
think it was
crazy.
the quality of fuel.
Yeah.
As soon as I got into China and put some decent fuel in, I was away, and it was literally the quality of fuel had a huge impact on your.
And diesel's quite hard to find up there, but petrol's okay, right?
Petrol's okay, and actually I was gonna, so you were running on diesel, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Because petrol was fine. I mean, you bought it out of bottles from the side of the road. They claimed it was 93 octane, which is interesting. Pretty sure it wasn't. I don't know. There were various times when I ran my bike. I don't know what I was running on. I'm pretty sure it was petrol, but it was working. I think that's the most important thing. And so my bike was a Yamaha Tenere. It's a 2009 one, which by modern standards is actually not that an advanced adventure motorbike. It's not like a KTM or a BMW, for example. And it ran okay on 80 something octane. But what I was going to ask is, because we, as I said, we met in Bokhara in Uzbekistan. How did you deal with the gas and diesel shortage? Did you have a diesel shortage? Because we found when we came from Kazakhstan, and I was with a group of Polish bikers, we couldn't find any petrol until we got to Nukus, and even then we were buying on the black market.
Yeah, diesel was okay.
Yeah.
Diesel availability through there was okay. One place I was oddly surprised where it was difficult to get hold of diesel. Well, not difficult, but it wasn't obvious to get hold of diesel. Was actually through Iran. Like for a country that produces so much fuel, there weren't many fuel stations.
And is that because cars just run on petrol instead?
Well, I think so, but even then there just aren't many fuel stations that I noticed. And there were certainly times, there was one time where we had to stop and get fuel, and a fella driving a truck just gave us 40 litres of diesel for nothing. He was just going to take it.
For this short period of time I actually spent driving on Iranian roads, I didn't have any problems. The only other place that was difficult was Uzbekistan.
Yeah.
Because it was more gas orientated.
Yeah, it's all LPG and gas.
The trick, and this is the gems I'll give to your listener here, is look for truck stops on the edges of cities. And I just asked the guy at my hotel, and he took me to a truck stop, and they've just got containers of it and stored away for where all the trucks are. So it's there. You just need to know the place to go and find it.
And that's why I found in Uzbekistan as well. To get petrol, I asked the hotel manager where can I find petrol, and they either took me to, on one occasion they took me to, it was in Bokhara actually. They took me to the only petrol station in town. There was just this huge queue, which must have been 500 metres long, of cars. And the hotel manager was just like, "No, follow me." Takes me straight to the front of the queue, which I felt guilty about at the time. But then equally, I was just like, "Yeah, I can't bother to queue for 500 minutes, to be honest."
Goddamn Westerners taking liberties.
So I probably did my little bit to undermine Anglo's back.
Yeah. That's where you just go, Aussie, 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 oi, oi, oi.
Yeah, that's what the hotel manager is always very useful on that side of things.
Oh, look, there's always somebody prepared to help if you ask the question, right? And language isn't. We've become reliant on voice, but there's so many other ways to communicate through hand and signals, and you find that actually you don't need too many signals to get the basic message across, right? My popular favourite one was the slit of the throat and then point at something, normally my throat.
As you say, normally Boris's gearbox.
It's broken down, and they go, "Okay, there's a problem," and then they'll be away. No problem.
I found that actually since I've been back, my ability to play,
charades.
Yes, is amazing. And people have commented "You're really good at charades." It's like, yeah. So what you get for 4 months in the former Soviet Union, not being able to speak any Russian at all.
Yeah. I think it's beneficial having that kind of ability to. And one thing that's really useful is you will find a way to communicate, and certainly when there's technical problems, if there's problems with bikes or cars, one thing I found was just drawing pictures.
Taking
photographs. Yeah,
take a picture book can be one way of doing it.
Yeah.
These days, I think your phone can have everything. It can do it all with you, and you can keep enough on there.
Picture book is a good idea, though. I didn't do that. I wish I had.
I had a bunch of things that I just didn't use because
yeah.
I just found I didn't need it. I quite like the challenge of trying to communicate without being able to speak to them.
Like we took a photo album of family photographs, which was just amazing. Like you'd find people who would just welcome you into their house unconditionally for you to stay for as long as you wanted, and just having a photograph album of your family is enough, because everyone can understand that if there's a photograph of you with all your family stood in high order, you know, that transcends everything, and people are really curious to kind of see that.
You have a big map as well.
Yeah.
Then you can draw and show them where you're going and where you've been, and they just like, wow, woo. There's so much you can do.
I found when I got to India, though, a few people I spoke to, when I explained to them where I'd come from, they was like, no, you're lying. Flat. They just refused to believe me.
They just looked at you and thought, there's no way this idiot could have made it.
All right. No, that's what my family feels.
And then what? As far as your bike rides, Ed, bike rides. I have to be careful how I phrase this. It's hilarious. Emma will always say that we haven't been on a holiday. We've been on an adventure or an expedition or a trip, or we've been travelling. And then I spoke to an old friend of mine, a guy called Jack, who was a previous podcast, and he had been on a cycling trip all through South America, and he just straight out called it a holiday. He was like, I've been on a really long holiday. And I thought that was quite brazen and quite bold.
It's one way of viewing it.
It's one way to look at it. I've completely lost my train of thought of where I was going with this. Oh no, I've remembered. Before you left to do South America, what was your reason for taking a motorbike? Had you purposely decided to take a motorbike, or did a motorbike choose you?
I decided to take a motorbike because I just love thrashing around on a motorbike.
Yeah. And where does that come from? Does that come from like...
Yeah, honestly, the only career option I've ever really wanted to do is be a pilot. To be honest, I was 9 years old when I realised that I couldn't be pilot of Thunderbird 1, and I was absolutely gutted at that.
Motorbike was second best.
And I remember the first time I opened up the throttle on a big bike, which was part of my training and it was only a 500cc, and it was July 2008. I remember I was coming in out of a 30 into a 60, and I've got the instructors kind of filling the earpiece saying, open it up, and I just thought, holy shit, this is... Farmland's fucking amazing.
Yeah.
And I then didn't do any touring. I did the classic post-breakup tour in 2010. 1 week, California, Harley Davidson. Nothing but a rucksack. Didn't know what the hell I was doing. Just did it, winged it. And I did another trip in 2012 on my bike, which was a Triumph Bonneville, just thrashing around Europe for 2 weeks. And then 2013 I did another summer trip to Istanbul and back in 2 weeks. So they were trips, and I think if you'd asked me at that point, I'd be like, yeah, I would have been quite kind of probably a little bit cocky and a little bit kind of like, yeah, I know what I'm doing. The reality was I did not know my arse from my elbow. I'd never had a puncture, I'd never had a breakdown, I'd never had to deal with an adverse situation or of any kind whatsoever. And to be honest, I've been in Europe, and travelling in Europe is great, it's fantastic, it's easy. I mean, Europe will always be my first love for travelling in many ways, but it is a very easy place to travel ultimately. So all of that kind of fueled my desire to I knew that I wanted to do a big trip from probably latter part of 2012 onwards. For various reasons I couldn't go in 2014, during 2014, and then it got to the start of 2015 or got to the end of 2014. It was apparent I could go in 2015, and I decided to go. But once again, I didn't know anything. Even when I left to go for London Sydney, I didn't know anything about mechanics. Anything at all. I'm not a mechanically minded person whatsoever. I didn't even have to change my brake pads. I didn't have any preparation in that sense whatsoever. So when other overlanders take the piss out of me down the way about how much gear I had on me, it's simply because I didn't know what I would need, so I kind of over-catered, which is a classic thing to do. So, I taught myself and dealt with it as time went on. If a fool like me can get on a modern motorbike and ride it all the way to Sydney, trust me, anyone can. Because I had zero mechanical knowledge. All I had was a desire to see stuff with my own eyes and a love of thrashing around on a motorbike.
Yeah.
That's all I had. No expertise beyond that.
Yeah. And how about you, John, as far as mechanical knowledge goes? Were you mechanically minded before you left, or?
Nope.
Yeah. I think.
Are you now?
Nope. I did my research in terms of what would be the right sort of vehicle. I tried to approach it in as professional a sort of manner as I could. Obviously with withstanding my lack of experience, because I'd not done anything before, but all the research pointed to the best vehicle to take would be an 80 series Land Cruiser, which would, Land Cruiser being Asian, good fit there, 80 series computerized, so every time it broke down there was always somebody who could fix it. I mean, it broke down, I just came out of Afghanistan where there was nothing, and half an hour later it broke down in Tajikistan, and I had nobody I could speak to, and I spent the day tracking down mechanics, and they came back with 3 tools in a little toolbox, and I had all my tools, I had all the kit in the back so that if anybody needed something I had it, and we were able to get the car going again. Great. Yeah, no problem.
You put more research into your equipment than I did. My first trip, the trip I did from Buenos Aires to Lima, I did it on a Triumph Bonneville. And I have to quote Austin Vince here, because I told Austin Vince about my plans. I met him at I think it's an Explorers Connect event in London, and he looked at me and said, "That is an absolute folly." And he kind of was right, actually, to be honest. I mean, he had no trouble. He kept up with some of adventure motorbikes when I was out there, but I didn't. I chose that was a classic heart over head decision to take that bike to South America.
Yeah,
and it got trashed at the end of it. Yeah, not that it was my fault.
I think it's reassuring to know, though, that I think people will find all kinds of reasons not to undertake trips like this, and I think one of them is I don't have any mechanical knowledge, because people are worried, but I don't think that's an excuse.
Lack of resource I can understand for overland. I think it's different for cycling, but lack of resource I understand because there is, a resource requirement for it. But lack of mechanical knowledge, no. In my opinion, no. I don't think it's an excuse. I think as long as you've got a desire to go and a bit of money behind you to do so, then I'd say resource is more a reason, is understandable more than lack of
it just cost me more money because I wasn't able to do the preparation work on my vehicle. I had to use a mechanic for that. It's super cheap when you're on the road getting work done, but it just cost me more cash basically.
You can always find a way to squeeze the budget as well. I learned a lot about my personal finances on the route in terms of how to really squeeze them more and more, particularly since my original trip was meant to be 6 months and it ended up being 12 months. So I had to start making decisions halfway through saying, look, if I want to make it to Sydney and I've got to make my budget stretch twice as long as I expected, so I need to start making some hard decisions about what I'm doing. Now, as it happened, I had also, by that point in the trip, discovered an unhealthy appetite for sleeping rough in various places and wild camping in various places for some bizarre reason. So that kind of helped as well, and eating.
Just as far as that kind of leads me nicely onto the probably the last question. I'm aware we need to wrap it up. I've let it go on a little bit longer because there's 2 people here. Normally I'm into speaking to
2 for the price of 1.
2 for the price of 1.
2 guinea pigs for the price of 1.
But as far as what you were just saying then, what kind of traits? I'll let you have 2 each. What kind of traits would you say make a good overlander? If John wants to go first.
My favourite that applies to everything and is pretty much a motto of mine is just a she'll be right attitude.
I'm only going to let you have that one. We don't need any others.
Fine.
Yeah. Things have a way of working out.
Yeah, nice. Look, you just, when you're planning and when you live in our environment that we have here and you've got so much clutter in your mind with all the things you bills and everything you've got to do, you can't quite imagine how you're going to solve certain problems. But when you get out on the road, all of that disappears. You have nothing but all day to solve any particular situation or problem or challenge. I prefer to think it's problems as challenges now, because there's just way too many problems occur. When you're fully focused on solving a challenge that's in front of you, you'll find a way, guaranteed.
Yeah.
So if you can just think, she'll be right, you'll figure it out. That's quite empowering in terms of just getting you off your ass in the first place to go off and try.
Yeah. And you, Ed? 2 traits?
Two
Maybe,
traits.
Actually, I'll give you one.
I think desire to see things through your own eyes and explore.
Yeah.
A little bit deeper than yours, John. I think that is it. I think it's because I think choosing for me, deep down, that was the thing about the motorbike. It was a freedom thing. Yeah, it was the buzz of riding a motorbike and getting to see some fantastic scenery on the way. For me, it was the scenery is always the kicker. But it's the range and the opportunities that it gives you to see things in your own terms, and the freedom that comes from that is allows you to see things in your own terms. And I guess it's probably the thing. I think if there was a second, I don't give it a second anyway, even though you're going to ask for it. Which is probably I don't know. It's I don't know what makes these things work. I just ride them, and what I mean by that is, you know what, you can go in with the attitude of, you know what, I don't know how this works in terms of. That's a quote from Kelly's Heroes, in case you're wondering.
Okay.
Because Oddball, the guy who drives a tank.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, it's like this amateurish. It's. I don't mean that to say it's a willful ignorance, although it sounds like it. It's more of a case of, if you go in the attitude of like, I don't know how this is going to work. I'm just going to ride a bike, and it'll all work out somehow.
Yeah. Ultimately, you both just said the same thing.
Yeah, I guess so.
See how it pans out. Anyway. I'm aware that it's getting quite late, and John and I do actually have to catch the last train, or we're never going to get home.
That's right. I don't have a vehicle to drive anymore.
My bike's downstairs with a flat tyre and a flat battery and an oil leak.
Yeah. Why don't you get it fixed?
But what is really beautiful about this situation is that we can actually probably record another one again sometime soon, because we could easily sit here and talk for hours and hours and hours. So I'm going to wrap it up quickly. I'm not even going to let you promote anything. I will, however, post links to your film and your website.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And then I think in a couple of weeks' time or early next year, we'll record another one for sure.
Yeah.
Pleasure being here.
Yeah, wicked. Thank you very much for your time.
Cheers.
Ta-ra.
It was great to catch up with Ed and finally meet Jon after so many years, which resulted in one of my favourite podcasts to date. This may or may not have been down to the fact that the conversation was lubricated by beer. We talked for about 2 hours before we started recording, whilst we were waiting for a pizza to arrive, and during that time it became quite apparent that both Jon and Ed have so much wisdom and knowledge to share. So at some point in the future, I think we'll try and speak to them both again individually about their experiences. We briefly touched on Jon's movie about his overland journey. It's entitled The Great Game. So be sure to check it out on his website, thegreatgamemovie.com. All the links will be posted on our website, which is theoverlandingpodcast.com. I'm eternally thankful to be able to host this podcast and talk to so many inspirational people like Jon and Ed. So thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, which is free, and review us on iTunes and Stitcher by searching The Overlanding Podcast. And please check out our website, theoverlandingpodcast.com, where you'll find supporting information and photos and links for this and every other podcast we've released. We love to engage with our listeners, so please find us on Facebook /The Overlanding Podcast and on Twitter @Overland Podcast. You can help support the show just by listening and telling others about it. If you like what you've heard, please share it with your overlanding buddies and help spread the word. If you're an overlander yourself and have an interesting story, we'd love to hear from you. We'd especially like to hear from solo female overlanders and families. You can email us at aroundtheworldin800days@mail.com, subject heading podcast interview. Okay, until next week, remember to double check your GPS coordinates. Bye.